Welcome to the Living Medicine podcast, where we talk about ethical medical use of psychedelic psychotherapy, teaching skills, examining the issues, and interviewing interesting people. Now let's start today's show.
Hello, everyone. This is Dr. Sandy Newis, and this is Living Medicine, the podcast. And Living Medicine, this podcast is sponsored by Living Medicine Institute, which is a business where we provide training and content and resources to clinical and medical professionals who are interested in learning more about psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. So I am very excited today to have Dr. Harvey Schwartz. He is one of the co-founders of Polaris Insight Center, which is a place providing training and also resources for psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy, and one of the first places I ever did training. So I feel really honored to have Dr. Harvey Schwartz here. He is one of the co-founders, and he is a licensed psychologist with more than 4 decades of experience as a psychotherapist, supervisor, teacher, trainer, and author. He is one of the lead trainers as well as co-founder for Polaris Insight Center, where he's played an important role in training and mentoring the next generation of psychedelic-assisted psychotherapists through clinical education and experiential training. So this is kind of a long bio, but I really want to read it. I can see that you're kind of getting twitchy, Harvey, but I want to just read it because I think it's relevant. Harvey brings a depth and a breadth and depth of clinical experience to his work, and that's something for me that personally stands out. He specialized in complex PTSD and severe dissociative disorders and has worked with survivors of a lot of different abuse, trauma, and psychotherapy trauma. And his approach integrates relational, psychodynamic, and psychoanalytic perspectives with archetypal, transpersonal, and existential traditions. And one of the things that I've also been drawn to is particular attention to the relational field, transference and countertransference, and the therapist's own inner experience. He's been involved in all the things, the MAPS trials and MDMA-assisted psychotherapy for PTSD, and has done a lot of that work, and also has an interest in other non-ordinary states of consciousness, so spirituality, shamanic, and teaches wise, ethical, and compassionate practice. And he's an author. So he's an award-winning author of several books on dissociative disorders and is currently writing a book on countertransference in psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. So I'm very excited to be here. And as I mentioned when we were meeting, just kind of chatting before we started, is that I honestly see you as one of the wisdom keepers and elders in this field. And elders to me doesn't mean age. It means someone who has been one, who has evolved the field and, really helped us move forward from where we are. And I just really appreciate that about you. So thank you so much for being here.
Thank you. Thank you for that warm welcome and for the honor of what you said. Thank you.
You're welcome. So, all right. So how did you get into the field? And the field means, of course, we could talk about how you got your PhD and, all of those different things.
In the psychedelic field, right?
Yeah. But how did you get into psychedelics and then psychedelic assisted psychotherapy? What brought you to the moment where you committed to that particular journey?
Yeah. Thanks for that question. Well, I think it's good to just remind you and the audience that I had 35 years of working in the severe dissociative disorders field. Yeah. And I wasn't really aware of any research or anything going on in the psychedelic world, although my interest in psychedelics started when I was a teenager and got exposed to them right around the time that Nixon was doing his dubious deed of scheduling things for political reasons against the African-American, Black, and anti-war communities in America. So we know that been documented that he used that as a weapon to target those communities. So around the same time, I was exposed to the LSD, and it was a life-changing event. So it kind of opened me up spiritually and cosmologically at a young age. So I had a deep gratitude to that medicine, that sacred substance. And but then my career took a different direction. And I was working with, survivors of complex PTSD, survivors of organized abuse, which is my specialty, which is still a marginalized field within our field.
That's a huge deal. Let me just name that's, very few people have that expertise, organized systemic abuse.
Right. Even though now with the Epstein material coming out, there's some budding awareness of the extent of trafficking networks in the world and things like that. I think most people either don't know about it, don't believe it, don't want to hear it, or can't tolerate the intensity of the information. So I had that career. And as I was moving along in that career, I started realizing that I cannot, these therapies go on for a long time, that I probably should start thinking about, winding things down or, besides the consultation I was doing. And by accident, one day, randomly, I pressed this YouTube video about the MAPS studies.
Oh,
I had
interesting.
no idea that was going on whatsoever. And it was like, I thought, this is around 2015. I
Yeah.
thought, wow, how did I miss this? My head is so buried over here in this part of our field that I didn't know that actual research is going on in
Yeah.
psychedelic world. So I missed that whole thing, which started like in the late 90s, actually. So, and that MAPS was recruiting for their first group of therapists.
Yeah.
And so I just called a colleague of mine in San Francisco who said she knew about it. And she said, if you apply, I'll apply. She was sort of a same age peer. We both applied. And at the 11th hour, I was accepted into the first group of trainers. And there I met Eric and Veronica in the first randomly assigned Airbnb. And from there, my life changed.
Okay.
So, okay, the stars aligned, and we might, for those who believe in, contracts we make before we come into this lifetime, it was going to be a contract that we found that we were going to be doing together. We all had a strong
So I
belief.
got to just interrupt you on that one because
You can interrupt me whenever you want.
Eric and Veronica have been on the podcast and have been lovely guests, and I've been in their presence a few times as well. So and I really respect all of you. So I mean, did you like very literally like just find like kindred spirits in each other, like sitting in the living room? I mean, was it?
Well,
kind of
it was sort of like, of the 60 people, we were placed in the same Airbnb
Yeah.
as complete strangers.
Right.
And within a couple of days, just we saw that we had a similar passion for non-ordinary states of consciousness, for the intersection of depth therapy, somatics, and transpersonal work. And we just sort of spoke the same language. But I think it was like one of those soul recognition things. You don't know it at the time, but you look back on what you were feeling because there was the novelty of meeting each other, the excitement about being in the training, which was Southern California at that point. Anyway, it was the first training that Annie and Michael Mithofer did, and Marcella was the third. There was only three of them at that point. Yeah. So we met, and that was the beginning of a life-changing experience because now I knew this whole world was opening up. And in that point, it was a very innocent world. It was not filled with all the drama and trauma that has been in the field for the past 5 or 6 years. And from there, we sort of ended up waiting too long for this MDMA trial to start. And in that interim, Phil Wolfson was doing his first ketamine training. And so we connected with him through Julene, who is a colleague in MAPS. And then we began to be trained by him. And then we thought, let's open up a clinic and start working with psychedelic medicines that are legal before we have to do the trial. The two things came together around 2018. And the trial began, and we started the clinic at Polaris. We had not yet even thought of doing a training program or training company. And literally, if you would have asked me 10 years before that I would be teaching and training and working, that was never my mission or my vision. So it was sort of like just happened that we began doing a little bit of teaching for local therapists in the community. And that kind of dovetailed into COVID when we had promised to do a small group training. And now what we're going to do, everything was shut down. So Veronica, bless her ingenuity, said, well, let's do it online. To which I said, no way, I don't want to teach at all, let alone teach online. What are you talking about? It's so weird now how many thousands of hours I spent teaching online. But at that moment, it was a little intimidating, overwhelming. It wasn't something I thought I was supposed to do. But to be honest, there was sort of almost a push from whatever you want to call the universal source that sometimes supports us, like just do it, dude, just do it. And so we did our first training, and I survived the anxiety of that initial, and then something just shifted. And I thought, like, okay, this is a way of sharing what we believe. This is a way of getting the message out. This is the way of taking care of future clients in the world by training therapists, which is something I've always been interested in. Also in preventing harm, because I've experienced a lot of work with survivors of therapy harm. So that's kind of where it took off. And then after the first module, I said, well, what about this, and this? Nobody's teaching this, and this. And I thought, let's do module 2 and then module 3. And so the whole thing just bloomed like an algae bloom. Really quickly.
Well, I mean, I did that. I did 1 and 2, maybe 3. I can't remember. But I did that during COVID, so it must have been in the early days. And I will say that I remember sitting there being like, these people are real clinicians, and what that means to me is people who come from a mental health intentional use of psychotherapy background, where you're merging it with the medicine, and that's something that I've always really honored and appreciated with you all about what you're doing. It's what I'm trying to do also with Living Medicine Institute is work that synergy. But I remember feeling that recognition, like that's like these people are clinicians first, and have always.
Yeah, I think that's part of our allyship in the field. But I joke whenever I teach, I jokingly say, not so jokingly, we're not squeezing a relationship into a molecule. And we're not bypassing a relationship for a molecule. We're adding a molecule to a therapy relationship to optimize, deepen its capacity for transformation and healing. What is so complicated about that?
Right.
That's not, everybody doesn't agree with that.
Depends on who you ask, right? It's like,
yes.
right.
Yes. It's not a pharmaceutical.
We're doing psychotherapy where the medicine is a tool. And, I don't believe we're doing medicine work and then we're doing therapy around what comes up. I believe we're doing therapy with medicine as a tool. And that doesn't sound.
I'm sorry. I think language. I think our language, unfortunately, our Western language is very bifurcated and is prone to like very compartmentalized black and white. And as you can see from my background, I'm a hybridizer and I believe in hybridization, cross-pollination. And one of my upsets with our field is that it is so siloed now. Almost like teams in the national or national league. Are you a DBT therapist, a CBT therapist, a somatic therapist, psychoanalyst, Jungian analyst, and people are loyal to their team. And one of my big pitches about the psychedelic world is this is the place where we hybridize. This is the place where we cross-pollinate with each other professionally. And I hope the psychedelic field doesn't become another, dogmatic ideology about how to do it only one way. And so, psychedelics are at the crossroads of everything from anthropology to metaphysics to spirituality to biology to psychopharmacology. There's no field actually that has more academic crossroads than psychedelics. So for that reason, can we please honor hybridization, responsible hybridization, cross-pollination? Let's learn from each other, create new protocols that are not just this or that, but kind of new blends. And so we don't have the language of blending. We're always trying to superordinate therapy to the molecule, to transpersonal. We believe in a biological, psychological, and transpersonal integrated model at Polaris, which I'm sure you do as well. But even that, our language is always like including things because we've been taught to bifurcate in the way we think about our field and the way we think about diagnostics as well. So hybridization, synthesis, integration, those are the languages I think we have to use for the movement of psychedelic field going forward in a mature way.
Yeah. Well, and it's interesting. I mean, I've mentioned this on other, shows, and I think we talked about it when we first met. But, I come from a wilderness and adventure therapy background, which actually I did my dissertation on the application of clinical theory and method to this multimodal, multidisciplinary field. And so
exciting.
I witnessed that and was part of that happening there. So for me, that rolls over. That's a lens that I was actually taught, and that rolls over into psychedelics. But I'm sure you see this in training too, where people come in and they're like, "What's the protocol? Like, can I get like certified in this particular way?" And that's a new emergence in the field, right? Not just in psychedelics, but in psychotherapy in general.
Yes, minus the Gestalt movement, which I think was an attempt to correct the kind of interpretive cognitive type of movement early in the 60s and 70s. You're lucky because you already knew that experiential learning is where transformation happens. Nobody had to convince you of that. You already were signed on for that. But so many other people have been trained or have been raised in systems, it's the opposite of the indigenous culture, way of like you learn through your head, not through your body. And you learn through concepts, not through experiences. And everything has to be explained or understood before you can actually validate it. This world that we're leaving for the psychedelic space is, pushing back on this form of healing, this form of learning, this form of knowing, because it's ambiguous, it's uncertain, it's much more impressionistic, doesn't always line up with the way our culture has taught us to think, feel, and be and heal. So you're lucky. You're lucky that you.
Well, because I don't know, this is kind of a bit of a sidebar, but I find myself more and more steering people away from the idea that psychedelics are all about the aha moment. Like insight can happen, but it's not all about that. It's like an experiential, in-depth process of relating to self-world and others with a lot of non-ordinary kind of, state work attached to it. And I don't know if you have thoughts about that, because like there's such a drive, like as if you're going to have this experience and like suddenly like something's going to explode in your head and everything's going to be different. And that doesn't usually happen. I mean, maybe I'm not doing a good job, but like, I don't know, that's not been my process.
I think you're raising the topic that I call expectation management 101, with which all of our clients, we have to orient them towards what you really can expect from this experience and what is the most valuable part of the experience, which we can't tell them what it will be. We can orient them. And I think our field is actually, unfortunately, besieged by a lot of negative influences on people before they walk in the door. The war on drugs legacy, or how about, Vice TV's legacy, or what other people have told the client they're going to experience. And so I really feel very few people come in with beginner's mind. And we could talk about beginner's mind all we want, but very few people actually are there. And they're really not listening that deeply in some of the intake and prep because they're so nervous or excited to get on with the process. So sometimes I feel like they don't really hear us when we say it's not about the aha moment. It could be challenging. It could be wonderful. We're welcoming everything. We're teaching you the principle of welcoming everything. And I think it's a beautiful principle, but I don't think everybody is actually getting what we mean by that until they've had 3 or 4 sessions of not making a judgment about what this means or what this is after 1 or 2 ketamine sessions, because the human mind wants to prematurely foreclose on what something is, or the human mind is trained to want to like mimic or imitate something they heard is the transformational element. So yes, I'm glad that you are not supporting the aha moment movement. And the problem with ahas, by the way, when they happen is they're kind of slippery and hard to hold on to. And so when they do happen, there's a lot of work to sew that into the fabric of your life.
Right. Well, and it's interesting because like a very core concept in like experiential education, like, put forth by my colleagues and who are researchers in that field is like, it sounds so simple. It's kind of silly. They're like, the what, now what, and so what? You know what I mean?
That's beautiful.
It's very straightforward though. And it's directly applicable to, to medicine work. Because like you've had the medicine, but like, okay, even if you did have a big realization, like, is that going to change your life forever? Like maybe it might give you more of a felt sense of control about the why and understanding yourself. But does it change, anything really tomorrow or the next day or 3 weeks from now? I'm not sure.
Well, you're bringing up another issue. So we're just jamming here. Is that okay? So tell me if I'm getting off course. So you bring up, you're not using the word, but to me, you raise the issue of humility and the humility factor in our field, which is a 2-hour conversation at least, because I think when we approach this work with humility, it means that we don't already know everything. We leave some of our expertise at the door. We hold on to some of our expertise. We live in a lot of the uncertainty, ambiguity, artistic space in the field without having to collapse things into premature understandings or meanings. That's the beautiful part of the work. But it's not for everyone because not everyone wants to work in a space where they don't feel competent. And a lot of therapists are trained to be highly competent, and competency seems to be organized through forms of training that make people feel in control, or that they know, or they're the expert, or they know what's coming, or they can give protocols and they can follow steps and they can feel somewhat competent through control, not competent through experiential openness and curiosity. So we're talking about training, leading into training, a little bit different kind of competencies, right? Competencies of tolerating ambiguity, tolerating uncertainty, tolerating not knowing, working in a field where things aren't exactly clear, being more collaborative than domineering, developing a new kind of expertise. So this is one of the challenges of training, because people have to unlearn 80% of what they learned in graduate school if they come into the field while still holding on to basic understandings of the frame, transference, kind of transference. So it's challenging, I think, training folks.
Well, it's interesting because one of the things that like people, this comes up for me a lot when I, we do retreats too at Living Medicine Institute. And, I'm always like, one of the things I apparently say a lot because it sticks with people is like, suspend the need to know. Like when you're, in your journey and when you're sitting with somebody, just suspend the need to know, like stay in the curiosity and just stay in the inquiry and just be curious. That's interesting. Let's just be curious about that and then stop. Like you don't need to know what that's about in that moment. And if you're driving for the what, well, that tells you something about yourself, right? And it might tell you something about who you are, and it might be more of a kind of, personality or defensive mechanism, but it's not really going to get you somewhere. That's not what it's about, in my opinion. It might be, but only if it naturally emerges.
Or we could explore the drive. We can sort of dive into what is the drive that's driving you without, judging it, or it's like, let's look at the drive. Can we be inside the drive? And the other thing about not knowing is I sometimes say, can we not know together? Because I do think there's something about companionship, collaboration, and I'm going to use this word, which is really important to me as a therapist and training, is accompaniment.
Oh, nice. I've never heard that word before.
Accompaniment is, because I come from a relational tradition that really favors mutuality as a process with the understanding that there's an asymmetry in psychotherapy, even if there's mutuality, because the person is coming, they're paying us, they're coming to us with some degree of expectation of our professional knowledge. So there's an asymmetry, right? But there's also mutuality in relationship to that. So those two forces are sort of juggling with each other. So when I say, can we not know together? There's sort of an invitation into humility together of exploring as equals for a moment or two, for an hour. And so I think the not knowing also needs to be relationally attuned.
I love that. So that was one of the things that I actually remember you speaking about was about having a relational approach to CAP. And that when I started doing that work, I was just like inherently thinking it was inherently relational and because it's an experiential process and we're joining together an experience. But you gave me permission to take that further and to link that into my kind of psychodynamic, I was trained in a interpersonally oriented psychodynamic tradition. So, it's all our sense of self is laid down through significant relationships, but then it shows up in the present moment. I mean, that's it in a nutshell. So if you could just
Could I just jam for you with, could I jam for a moment? You
yes,
use one of my
please.
favorite words. You use one of my favorite words, which is permission. So I'm really glad that I, in whatever teaching experience you have with me, gave you permission to know what you know and to explore, So the three P's are permission, protection, and playfulness. These are the three obligations of every therapist in psychedelic space. Permission, protection, playfulness. Permission is obvious. Permission is really a permission to vocalize, to move, to scream, to shout, to face anything inside of you. Permission to throw anything at me as a therapist. Permission within the boundaries of safety and, consent. Protectiveness, we're going to make sure that you don't fall off the couch. We're going to make sure we keep it safe. We're going to make sure there's a therapeutic frame that's consistent, predictable, reliable. And then playfulness. Psychedelic therapy, one of my big drum beats is, ready for this?
I'm ready.
Awe, wonder, joy.
Oh, yes. I love that.
Awe, wonder, joy, playfulness, spontaneity, improvisation are essential to the healing technology of psychedelic therapy.
Well, and it's so interesting because if you kind of break it down, like where psychedelic culture comes from, I mean, it comes from ancient indigenous traditions that it's not like people like laid, in a hut with eye shades on. Like, I mean, not usually. I don't know. I mean, I don't profess to know, but I think that, the collective experiences, the collective ecstatic experiences, the movement and the dance and the connectedness. And sometimes those are really fun. Like, I've had fun doing that. Like, the lightness of spirit that can come from that is profoundly therapeutic.
And in addition to that, we have to realize that our Western tradition has a suspicion around joy, humor, playfulness. There's a bias in our culture, kind of in our kind of Judeo-Protestant culture, whatever, the Western model around hard work, take things seriously. In order to get somewhere, we have to really work hard. And so sometimes we have to expectation manage our clients out of their idea, if they're having a very expansive, joyful session, that they're doing something wrong. Or they've been shamed. They've been shamed for their expansive self. And as Kohut gave the term, the expansionistic self, as a healthy understanding of the emergence of the self that is often crushed or belittled or humiliated. And so I think we're running into a lot of that in clinical work. We're running into the vestiges of people's beliefs or memories of having been squelched and bought into their squelching because they thought that was the way you're going to get to be healed or progress. So the whole playful idea of psychedelic therapy, I think, does run up against much of the Western model of healing and treatment and most of the way people have been raised to believe how things work in the world. So I can't tell you how many times I've had to help people honor the fact that the return of the capacity for joy and wonder, particularly wonder, the return of the capacity for wonder is healing. It's not sidestepping healing.
That's so interesting that you say that because I don't know if you're familiar with Bill Plotkin's work at all, like the book Soulcraft. It's a developmental model that's applied to like vision questing and the natural world. And one of the things that he did that I think is genius is he took developmental psych and he actually layered in like wonder and awe as like developmental critical processes that outdoor based and nature connection and experiential work can bring back. So, it's interesting I think that as well, that like, and this piece about like increasing the capacity for joy. I mean, we have a name, it's positive affect tolerance. Like if you need a clinical reason, like,
Well, there's such a bias against the value of positive affect tolerance. And
mm,
also, it's confused with hedonic culture in America and with our culture of happiness culture.
yeah, yeah.
So there's a lot of, I think there's discernment that needs to be made between self-indulgence, happiness culture, and the capacity for joy. And I think mainly I'm thinking about people who may not know that their joyful expressions were met with traumatic or neglectful or shaming responses,
Right.
particularly in certain religious traditions where
Oh,
exuberance and joy were associated with something dangerous or satanic or evil. There's a
right.
fair amount of people in our society who've been raised with this kind of ideology. And so even if they come into therapy to work on depression or PTSD, after some of that clears, we find what's underneath that are these very deeply ingrained allegiances to these very pathological forms of relating to self and other around suppression, negation, undermining as a form of control, which is going to theoretically get you somewhere. And our whole society does kind of have control
Mm,
versus consciousness as an organizing principle. So the psychedelic movement really is trying to move us from control to a consciousness oriented understanding of life and healing. And that is why there's such a collision between these models. And I feel like we're in the middle of the collision. There was a psychedelic renaissance, which is a complicated word because it was around for thousands of years. So who's the Renaissance is for Western white people.
right.
Um, but now the next phase really is there's a collision for economic reasons and control of the narrative of psychedelic therapy between the different schools of thought,
Mm,
CBT school, psychodynamic school, the indigenous, the pharmaceutical industry. There's a collision. We're at the collision, and it's really painful because it's not clear that the result is going to be a really beautifully hybridized model that favors depth-oriented and ceremonial indigenous understanding.
well, it's hard because when you put in the race for the money, right, then that becomes,
Exactly.
like I was trained as a psychotherapy outcome researcher, again, applying it to this adventure therapy, and that becomes relevant because I was actually taught like that you have to insert an evidence-based clinical model into an experiential process in
Mhm.
order to prove it scientifically, which is, that was the critique leveraged at the MAPS,
Yes.
training. And I've heard, good solid researchers argue that it shouldn't have been that. And yet that was such a beautifully crafted, really modern, in-depth, multimodal, therapy.
Initiatory quality, and with the quality of initiatory process.
Yeah. And I think that's a classic example. And, here we are now headed for like, psychedelic molecules going to be released with no therapy. Like, I mean, it seems like that's where we're headed, at least in the short
Yes.
term.
And I play with you. So one of the things you probably know when I teach is I really like alliterations, right?
Mm.
So the three P's that I just talked about before was protection, playfulness, and permission. Well, the
Yeah.
three dirty P's are power, prestige, and privilege.
Mm. Mhm.
Those three have entered the psychedelic space like a locomotive train crashing into a building. Once
Mhm.
upon a time, it was not like that. When I first came into the field, it was not, I don't think I would have stayed in the field. It
Oh,
was saturated with power, prestige, and privilege dynamics. But once
mhm.
upon a time, there was innocence,
Yeah.
idealism,
Right.
and I miss those days. I think I was naive to think they would last.
Mhm. Well, and the danger of people thinking that they have specialized sacred knowledge, like the emergence of that, at which point does that become kind of a narcissism? Like, I've witnessed, some kind of cult-like type emergence, and I mean, where people are hungry for sacred leadership, which I'm sure you've seen, and working in like cults for years, decades. I mean, that's one of the pieces, and the chase for the money, and
Well, this is sort of maybe an indirect link, but one of the beautiful parts, and I know you would agree with this from our previous conversation of psychedelic therapy, is that it returns the person to the empowerment of their own sovereignty
mm,
with accompaniment. And I think the cult problem is that we've been trained to externalize power, externalize divinity, externalize rescue, externalize help, so much that our whole system is based on, rescue fantasies and the elimination of your own power to heal yourself, to place it in an expert or in a doctor or in a pill or in a hospital or in a religion or in a priest. We've been saturated. And so the radical part of psychedelic healing and most of indigenous traditions are that people have direct access to the divine, direct access to the sacred. We don't need an intermediary. And that is, I think that underlying principle of psychedelic therapy is slamming into the cultural paradigm of the financial investment in intermediaries that separate people from their own power. So psychedelics, because we talk, whatever word you want to use, the inner healing intelligence, organic inner intelligence, soul, self, higher self, 100 different words for this thing that's often argued about if you use the wrong words. But I think we all know that there's an underlying wholeness in every human being, no matter how much they have been harmed. And it's that underlying wholeness that we are honoring in psychedelic therapy and helping people return to that connection with themselves. We are the bridge to help them go back to the connection with their own sovereignty. Doesn't mean we're not part of the process. Doesn't mean we don't have expertise. It doesn't mean that there's not mutual respect, but we're there to help return them to the point where they don't need intermediaries for them to know themselves, love themselves, and have access to information about who they are and what they need to do in the world. That's a radical implication of psychedelic therapy that the Western model, I don't think, is too hot on.
Well, it's interesting because, like, that's one of the reasons I think why I ended up gravitating to nature connection. Like, I actually am intentionally building in connection to the natural world, specifically at retreat. But I did this before in previous career. Bringing people into direct relationship with the natural world is bringing people in direct relationship to the sacred. I have a great deal of intentionality around that. Like, and I think it can be an experiential bridge that is, maybe a little less threatening. And, I'm like releasing this. Actually, we're really just bringing you into contact with the sacred, but we're like, kind of wrapping it in nature connection. But it's true. Like, we're not allowed to talk about that. And yet that's what we're doing. So
in terms of the nature connection, I think that sometimes when people are on psychedelics, they return to our understanding of nature as in they are a part of it. And I haven't done the work you've done, but I imagine that when people are out in the field long enough, hugging a redwood tree, which I've done many times, that the separation of the sacred from being outside of them to being within them, from a separation consciousness point of view, is dissolved in deep healing, psychedelically, and I imagine in nature-based healing. That the sacred may be found outside, but it's also inside, and the sacred within, and the sacred in the tree is reverberating. It's not a separation. I have to go outside of myself for the sacred, but something in me that is sacred recognizes something in you or in the tree that's sacred. And I think psychedelics and nature-based healing dissolve separation consciousness. And I believe separation consciousness, by the way, and scarcity consciousness are the two underlying collective forces that breed mental illness and pathological family dynamics in our society. So I'm getting a little ahead of the curve, but
no, it's okay. Say more about that. Like,
we want to see like what are
things. Yeah, just those dynamics and separation, scarcity. Like, say more about that.
I mean, remember that I have an interesting interest in the political, spiritual, and psychological, and or at a young age was quite steeped in anti-colonial stuff before it became popular. So I was sort of orienting towards understanding what the United States has been doing.
Yeah.
Under the false narrative of the great country that's saving the world. So at a young age, like at 14 or 15, I was very politically radicalized.
Oh, interesting.
So that's affected how I look at things. And so I'm sort of looking at the way in which society, religions have been structured with certain underlying belief systems, and scarcity and separation consciousness are two of the main ones that lead people, I think, to form, patterns of relating out of desperation, need, projection, power over, domination, because they're both illusions. Like we're not separate, and there is no real scarcity. We're not separate, and there's no real scarcity. So until those two belief systems are dissolved by churches, government organizations, mental illness will be supported by these two delusional beliefs in the collective. If there is no scarcity, meaning there's really enough to go around if we didn't have that distribution problem, and we're not really separate, And people in psychedelics come to know that directly through direct experience of I am whole and I am interconnected.
Mm-hmm.
That is a radical transformation of their personality and of what was once a mental illness or a diagnosis. This so powerful of an experiential knowing that it undermines all the structures that have been brought down upon the individual from their family, from their religion, from their society, and it kind of throws it open. Now, to keep it open is challenging. That's where integration happens. But those two beliefs are often challenged in psychedelic spaces. And one of my favorite jokes, but not jokes along these lines, is when a client or a patient or a participant, I use those words interchangeably, comes back and says this sentence, and I'm sure you've heard it, and I've experienced it. I am everything and I'm nothing.
Mm-hmm.
I'm everything, I'm nothing.
Yeah.
It contains interconnectivity and humility and participatory experiential knowing. And that one sentence, Sandy, that one sentence is the antidote. Right. If somebody can hold on to it. So I feel like even if they can hold on, it's like touching the center of a truth about how things are. Mm-hmm. That undermines all the belief systems of shame, self-loathing, self-hatred, eating disorders, addiction, all the belief systems that are part of mental illness. Because mental illness really is a lot of belief systems. You touch base with a kind of perennial philosophical truth. I'm everything, I am nothing. And there you have the nucleus of healing, like a kind of a tincture of healing.
And it's okay. So I'm sitting here pondering like this. And, there's, in my opinion, like that is so lovely. And there's a shadow side to that, which is like just speaking for myself, that, the further that I've gone into that, sometimes it feels like I'm separate. Like that I'm like, now I'm even more of a weirdo because I believe that we're all one, but it actually can like ping pong us back into separateness because it can actually be difficult to find others that you can relate to in just a day-to-day way on that level. I'm curious what you think about that, if you have any thoughts about that, because it's a real thing.
This is a great, interesting question. I didn't know that's where you were going to go, but I love the improvisational process we're in because we don't really know where we're going, right? We don't know where we're going. We have to trust that the separation consciousness I'm talking about is this kind of force that's endemic as a delusion into the collective that underlines our banking system. But the one you're talking about has to do with the alienation that people who are awakening out of this delusional system feel, either at the Thanksgiving table with their family or once they've realized that the things they believed are no longer true. There's not enough of us yet around to have sufficient community support to mitigate some of the loneliness and alienation. And so the point that you're bringing up, I'm going to riff on clinically, is that some patients, clients, or participants are faced with a difficult challenge once they start seeing through the illusion and the illusions that have kept them hostage to quote unquote mental illness. And that is, what do I have to give up to be my own sovereign being? What's the cost? And so there is a sense of a new kind of separation or alienation or outsiderness that you're talking about of people who are waking up out of the delusions of separateness, scarcity, and shame that our culture traps people in. So that's why community healing is so important. That's why integration circles are so important. That's why I think when I think about the question that we didn't get to, that we're zigzagging about the future of psychedelic therapy.
Well, let's still get there. And I still want to get there.
But this is sort of like getting ahead of the curve with that. Right. Like, I really think that if people do not have spaces to process and be part of new communities, I interviewed several of our MAPS clients years after the study. And the thing they all said was they wish they had other people who are going through the study to meet with once a month in a kind of support group style, so that their post-treatment struggles, their post-treatment insights, the uniqueness of their experiences could be held somewhere, that they felt lonely and isolated, even if they had a therapist who understood, they hungered for community. So I do think that if we are treating people and not placing them in communities to hold the next phase of their integration and, the intersection of community and individual psyches, which is a big part of, healing to be, then we're actually not going to be creating the movement we need to create. I'm just riffing on your.
But I'm with you. And, Dr. Roman Politsky from Emory University was on here, I don't know, a couple of months ago, and he's doing a study on adverse events. And one of them was like ontological shock, which is basically like we've seen that which we can't unsee. And that might be spiritual, that might be alternative universes, but I actually fit this into it too. The experience of oneness, the experience of deep connection with self-world and others, which is really like where I view most of the problems in human living come from, right? That's what trauma essentially is. And then we have a lived experience of not that, but then how do we go back to life on Tuesday, where everybody around us is mirroring a different version of ourselves, really, and reality? Like, that's a hard thing.
It's really hard. You're actually bringing up one of my favorite topics, which was not what the topic we were going to talk about today. It's ontological shock.
Are you okay with that? Because I can go back to our like guided.
No. I prefer improvisational.
Okay.
Ontological shock. I'm so glad you brought that up. I think it's a central force in human life.
Yeah.
And we see it in what you're talking about, the client who absolutely realizes that, for example, through therapeutic process and through maybe interdimensional experience, that what they believed about God, the world, church, whatever, is not true.
Yeah.
And that they have bought into a narrative of shame and minimization, marginalization, and they wake up out of that.
Mm-hmm.
There's a shock of waking up out of that makes you want to not wake up, because the pain of the shock itself and holding the new consciousness open without support, knowing that you might lose friends, you might lose respect, you might be projected upon, you might be called woo-woo, whatever. I think this is where the hero's journey part of psychedelic healing comes from.
Yeah. Interesting. I talk with clients about the liminal stage all the time. I was doing that at least 3 hours today, talking about the importance of just like having to learn to live with uncertainty. That you're in a change process, you're in a journey, and now you're swimming around in the liminal, like not knowing where you're going. And how do you stay in curiosity without a map? It's hard.
And how do you stay in curiosity without a map, with people projecting things onto you or telling you things, whether it's your family or your religious institution, about what your experience is or who you're supposed to be? How do you individuate? That's one of my other favorite words, like individuation.
Totally.
Thwarting, which happens so much in our systems, and individuation promoting, which is what you're talking about, which is what we do in psychedelic therapy to help people sustain. It's like a teenager leaving home. There's a wobbliness.
Yeah.
There's a wobbliness in the newness after ontological shock. Another example of ontological shock, not to get too political on you, but is the collective cannot face some of the revelations that are happening at the global level. Like, people know a little bit here or there, but I think the collective is being shocked at whatever level they can handle by the revelations of this much corruption. And so, my narrative about this, and it also affects therapy, is that 1/3 of the people, there's 3 ways to react to ontological shock or this kind of thing. One thing is to go backwards and dig in deeper to your system, your pathology, where you're from. Another way is to be, I've been waiting for this. I'm going to find others. I'm liberated. I'm going to stay with it. And then the third group was the group that we really need to help, the wobblers, the people in the middle who are coming out of these delusions of separateness and scarcity and ontological shock, realizing that the shame-based identity they had bought into is shedded now. They've touched something deeper and they can shed it. The wobbliness is like, how do they stabilize without relapsing, without going off the rails?
Well, and it's interesting because I think that actually, for me, that actually brings us back to psychedelic-assisted psychotherapy. With the bridge for me being, I talk a lot about, like, at a very basic level, it's about expansion and contraction. And to me, that's nervous system-based safety, and that a relational approach to helping people stay in expansion. To me, that's a bridge to what you're talking about. You tell me if that sounds like a similar thing or if I'm just off.
Yes.
My own feed here.
Yeah, but yes. And I think the bridge is, within expansion, there are going to be contractions that don't negate the expansion. And how do we help people not get confused when they're moving forward, that the wobbliness or the zigzagging which I'm sure you've heard me talk about many times, the zigzagging that's organic to the process does not mean they failed, they've lost it, or they haven't sustained the growth. That there is a kind of when you're really expanding, expansion is breaking through in the somatic experience or in the mind barriers, obstacles, obstructions. And so it's sort of like a snowplow. It's kind of coming through, hitting, and it's supposed to hit every obstacle. But when you hit a certain obstacle, there is a little bit of a, could be suicidal thinking. It could be a relapse in addiction. It could be a temporary relapse into the old thinking pattern. It could be, all of a sudden another trauma memory comes up because you've cleared the snow. So all of these things could feel like relapse or setbacks or it didn't work. And so I think a lot of the people we work with are so prone to futility and hopelessness thinking that we really have to help them understand the nonlinearity of the recovery process. So within an expanded arc, there's going to be these zigzags and how they are held as really valuable versus shameful or meaningful and significant versus wish that didn't happen is central to the role of the therapist. That frame, I think, is so central in the integration process.
So therapists, how do we as therapists do that? Like, what are your thoughts on how do you do that? How do you teach people to do that? Like, I know that's like summarize your whole career now in 5 minutes. Like,
but I have one kind of funny. I'm trying to think of how to make it not so sarcastic. I think. Let me say it this way. I think we all, as therapists, especially when we're younger, we want to feel competent, we want to feel effective, and we want to help people. Okay, all those three needs are coming from all kinds of places in our childhood development, and we may not have fully worked out what all of our motivations are before we've become the best therapists we can, because we're all still growing and evolving. And so laying that groundwork, I'll say that one of the main obstacles is helping young therapists not need to have success and not need to have the patients do well so they can feel okay. And so, yes, we don't want to do harm for sure, but let me leave that on the side. But this need for successful outcome, this need for the client to do better, this need to sometimes freezes young therapists from being exploratory, from taking risks, and also with the litigiousness of our field that's developed in the past 30 years, where every movement could be sued, every therapist could be sued for everything they've done or not done around suicidal monitoring and reporting elder abuse. And we're at the behest of so many demands legally that young therapists, I think, are kind of a little bit in a straitjacket. And so when they come into this work, they might unconsciously want their patients to perform doing well for them. So I start off answering your question is, can we be aware of the way in which we might need something from our clients or patients in order to regulate our narcissistic equilibrium? And can we, without shame, really look into that so that we're allowing our clients to do whatever they need to do? And that's the hard part, I think, to start with. So I'm starting at the hard part of your question is really about the therapist's unconscious interference in the process through their need for the patient to perform healing. To perform healing for them.
Expectation in reverse, right? Therapist expectation. Yes. Like, what does change look like?
Yes. What do I believe change looks like based on my ideology from my graduate school training, which we're asking people to put that on the side and enter into a new way of evaluating transformation. That's hard, to give up a lot of what you know, and also to look at the way in which you might be unconsciously influencing process through your best intentions, but also through your need to feel in control or competent. So that's why I'm interested in countertransference. That's why I'm writing a book on countertransference, because I believe the role of the therapist and how we've been trained hasn't been talked about enough in the field for us to begin to realize what kind of effect we have on the field.
Well, it's interesting because I'm just sitting here being like, I wonder, how can we articulate? Like I sense a lot into client energy, that's difficult to teach. Like, I'm really into the felt sense. I'm very into state versus content, and how connected I feel to the client. And that's a marker of change for me. And yet, of course, it's like purely subjective, you know, you know, is that, can I speak with that with reliability? And I have a lot of experience. And, you know, like if I'm really distracted that day, then I'm going to be less likely to use touch. Like I have some cautionary things that I use, but it certainly doesn't fit exactly into like a checkbox symptom based, moment, insight focused, you know, model of change. And yet it's also heavily reliant on my own awareness of my own internal process too.
Yeah, your own or my own internal process or patterns we have in the way we work.
Mm-hmm.
To be aware of like the certain strengths we all have and certain liabilities we all have.
Mm-hmm.
For example, I can growing up in New York City, people talk fast. And even though I've left there decades ago, sometimes I can sort of talk fast or get ahead of things. So that's something I'm aware of. So I know my strengths, but I'm always trying to see how I might be interfering with the process because I want more from the client than they want from themselves, or I want this session to have more pith in it. And I tend to be more of a skydiver than a hesitant type of therapist. So I also like us all to be aware of the way in which our strengths can be our liabilities, and that we rely on something that I think is a strength. We can always have something on the side of us going like, what am I missing? What am I missing? In a good way. Like, yeah, I have a felt sense, but what am I missing? And what are my clients telling me about me that I need to listen to? What are they saying about how they're perceiving me and how they're feeling me? It's not always, often isn't projection. There's something really interesting about the way they're telling us they feel how we're being with them. And so I always like to kind of listen to what they're saying, for what they might be.
Like, what do you ask? Like, if you're like, if you're like, I like to listen about what they say, like, if you were teaching somebody how to do that, like, what do you invite them to say? Or how can therapists learn how to do that work well? Like, what do you recommend?
Great question. Getting pragmatic. Well, one pragmatic I can tell you, and I've taught this. You probably heard me say this in one of the modules, is from the intake to the first prep session. I really emphasize the collaborative nature to the comedic point of if there's something you don't like or something that's happening in the process in the room, the furniture, including the shirt I'm wearing to the session, please tell me. And I always have this joke because I had a client many years ago who didn't want me to wear a certain color shirt to the office. And I debated a long time whether or not that was something I should modulate for this person or whatever. And so that became a comedy with me and this person many years later.
Would
and
you
so
like to put a blanket over me? Would that be better?
Yes. Like, can I control the triggering effect of different aspects of my being or the room? But all this to say is like this is the P of permission, giving clients permission from the intake to be critical, to give negative feedback. And so we're trying to really have them subscribe to a mutuality-based program of relating. So that's sort of the informed consent intake, trying to orient them. And then as we go, we try to demonstrate it by, let's say the session went amazingly well, like it's great. And the therapist is feeling, well, this is so great. They saw the goddess. They don't have shame anymore. They're feeling wonderful. They're going to go back to work. And everything went really well. I just want to know what didn't go well. And can we just sit like, what would you like to be different? And even if they can't think of it, they're feeling that you're actually asking it, hopefully authentically. I do care. Not as just a technique. What would they like to be different? Even if it's the color shirt I wore to the office, even if it's down to that minuscule thing. And there was some research done a long time ago, by the way, that when clients gave therapists more critical feedback each session, they got better.
Oh, interesting.
I really believe, and I can't cite the research, it was about 20, 25 years ago, but I really want to encourage them. And then I want to ask how something landed. I always want to know, how did that land? Or I feel like something didn't feel right. How are you feeling me in the room right now? What are you needing from me? How are you feeling? How did that comment land? I want it to be like part of the regular conversation, that I am interested and curious about how they're responding to me and us and the field and the medicine and the room. So I'm trying to like almost create a new culture where that is part of our regular conversation. Mainly it's about giving, I'm sorry, go ahead.
I just think it's so important because it isn't like we can kind of analyze why they did or didn't, what did your person, why were they reacting to that color? And, that may or may not be relevant, but to give people a voice and to have people have the opportunity to be witnessed in having that voice, and that their voice matters, and that their intention matters and what they want matters. And, that's also a core tenet of trauma-informed care, right? It's just like this agency, choice, transparency. So I love that.
Yeah, it's all of those beautiful things. And it's also at another level, hopefully modeling intimacy. Like, how am I impacting you? How are you impacting me? Can we talk about awkward things? Like one client I work with, really, that was not the only, some of them hate the music on the playlist or have reactions to the music. And so, some of them feel squeamish about being critical. Some of them are like rip-roaring critical, but it doesn't matter because we want to make room for the negative emotions, quote unquote.
Yeah.
Like criticality, hatred, fear, all the emotions that were probably suppressed in people. We want to be like, we can handle this. We can survive this. We can handle this together. This is part of our play space. Nobody's going to be destroyed by criticism, hatred, anger, disgust. We can hold it together. And since psychedelics amplify all this, we really have to say, and we can hold this together because it's going from 1 to 10. And they need to know that we are going to hold it with them. We're not going to be blown away. We're not going to be afraid. We're not going to be intimidated. And if we are intimidated, that we can actually share, yeah, this was scary for me too, without losing the frame of somebody who's also holding the frame.
Right. I love that. So you're just advocating, just asking.
Asking and having inquiring into the process and their feeling about our role as an ongoing part of the dialogue.
Yeah. I was always trained like, that we're doing the work, but then we're talking about what it's like to be doing the work. So I might ask you about something, and then I might ask you about what it's like that I asked you about the thing. And then what was it like that you told me? Right? Like, which sounds kind of redundant, but isn't. It's really important.
It's really important. There's a comedic part to it where you're presenting, and sometimes it is funny. It is funny because because it could be cartoonified or caricatured as navel gazing or something like that. But I think it's really about breaking down the structures of disconnection, dissociation, and denial that people have been raised in, so that they actually have access to things because you created a permissive environment. They have access to thoughts, feelings, and movements that were previously prohibited. But just because you're saying, it's okay, whatever, tell me, there's things that can come forward that they'll be surprised about. Like, I didn't know what just came out of my mouth. Like, great, you didn't know. You didn't plan it. It was spontaneous emergence of your true self. Let's sit with that. Not analyze it. Let's just celebrate its emergence and sit with that.
Right. Yeah. And what is that?
Like a drawing.
Yeah. I love that. So we're nearing the end of the time. We just have a couple minutes. I want to just kind of, sort of offer like, a couple of things I wanted to ask you is like, what do you see as like the critical things for the field to be attending to? And then what do you see as the shadow side? And then kind of, I do see you as a wisdom keeper. And, what do you think are the most important things that we all just need to attend to based on who you are and what you've learned? And, like, what are your thoughts about that?
All my answers to this are going to come from my biases, but hopefully my biases are clear by the biography that you shared and by what I've told you. I believe in depth-oriented therapy that is very relational, that involves the field that's co-created in the room. And so I don't think therapists are being trained sufficiently, experientially trained with medicines and without medicines to work inside a field that they are stewarding rather than controlling. So I think a lot of training, supervision, and consultation with an orientation towards depth, dynamic therapy versus where I think things are going, which is not going to be in that direction.
Right.
So that's sort of my biased hope that there's at least going to be a sliver of the field, a 10% sliver that this kind of work is going to be conducted in that way. And I'm afraid, how do we help the field mature out of the mistakes of the past, out of the mistakes of racism, misogyny, power over? And I think the problem I have with that is that the critics of the field need to have critics of their criticism. So we also have a problem with so many different stakeholders, so many different turfs that how do we have some kind of sanity in the midst of all these different agendas that's focused on the training of therapists and exquisite care for clients? Like that's all that matters. Training, deep training of therapists, and then therapists getting the support they need. So that's the other piece. Therapists are not getting the support they need or the financial support they need to handle their workloads and to handle the stress of this work. And so there's an enthusiasm that happens in the initial phases of psychedelic work that might make people, and does make them, overwork. and overdo and overaccomplish. And then there's not enough support systems around to handle that, and not enough financial rewards and resources for people, because they're actually working more during psychedelic work than they are in other hours. And so they have to, maybe work less in the other part of their field. And so I feel like the world is sort of misusing therapists. Even though therapists, it seems like they have a privileged position in society, they've become the cleanup, janitorial, psychospiritual janitorial service for a society that has basically abandoned people who are suffering.
Totally. Well, and how do we, who are kind of deeply involved in it, and like I consider myself deeply involved in it, and how can I also still be messy and still be wounded
Yes,
and not be perfect and still
exactly.
be learning? Like I'm doing this work significantly different than I was 5 years ago, and my humanhood is significantly different than I was 5 years ago, and I think that's good. Please don't judge, like,
Can I forgive my 10-year ago self for its limitations? The way we ask our clients to work with having to, I'm using the word forgive in a more poetic sense here, come to a different relationship with the version of themselves that was not operating in integrity or in alignment.
right.
Yeah. So I think that, the field is going to go, unfortunately, under the influence of money,
Yeah.
power, prestige, and privilege, and pharmaceutical companies. And it seems as if the way in which the psychedelic movement might have changed the mental health system, I think the mental health system is about to absorb the psychedelic world. And that's really sad for me. And that's really sad as I'm aging out now. I had such a different vision for how it might go. And of course, I think there'll always be people like us who are doing this work that maybe isn't in the most kind of center of the field. What the field is going to become is, manualized, institutionalized, cosmetic, pharmaceutical, standardized, and nothing against some protocol structure, but I think it's the improvisational, ambiguity, creative part of psychedelic therapy that really leads to the greatest healing and transformation. And so I will say, on my way out, I'll say this, right? Art and science and spirituality were split apart in the Enlightenment in a very dangerous way, even though it was responding to what was happening in Europe with the church control. But now it's time for those things to come back together. Art, science, spirituality. They come back together in psychedelic healing.
They do.
Hurrah, hurrah. I love it. That's why I came into the field. So I don't want to see them, I don't want to see them split apart again.
Right.
And so my answer to your question is, can we keep those three elements coming together deeper as the psychedelic movement matures? And then I think all will be well.
Right. I love that. Well, thank you so, so much. Thank you for your time. Thank you for all of your accumulated wisdom and your ability to articulate it and share it. I'm extremely grateful, and I've really enjoyed all the different directions that this has gone. And thank you so, so much.
Can I say, you're welcome. Can I say one thing in response?
Yeah, please. Yeah.
Okay.
Say as much as you would like.
I hope that we modeled improvisational sessions today, because even though there was a bunch of questions that you sent to me, we didn't really get to a lot of them, but that was part of it. And then we just jammed, and kind of what you said led to what I said. And this is what like a really good integration session looks like.
Yeah. Oh, I love that. Because in my
we modeled. Sorry.
Because in my mind, we actually did. Like we talked about psychodynamic and depth psychology. We were talking about relational psychology. We didn't get too much to the dissociative disorders, but that's so funny because I'm like, actually, I thought we followed the outline. Great.
That's great. That's great. Perfect.
Well, thank you again. Anything else that you want to say before we close?
No, just thank you so much for your warmth and your invitation and your presence, and you're fun to jam with.
Oh, I feel the same. So thank you. Appreciate it. All right. Bye-bye.
Thanks for listening to Living Medicine. We'll see you again next time. Be sure to click subscribe to get future episodes.